you cannot market something that doesn't work. Gone are the days where you can create a brilliant campaign for something that is absolutely awful.
Hello, I'm Neil Perkin, the host of Think with Google Firestarters, and Firestarters is a series of insightful conversations with the interested and interesting of the advertising, marketing and innovation communities. And today I'm lucky enough to be speaking with Lou Downe. So Lou is the founder and director of the School of Good Services, a former director of design and service standards for the UK government, and also the author of a brilliant book on good services called Good Services, How to Design Services That Work. Excellent book. And Lou, welcome to Firestarters. So I'd like to dive straight in, if that's all right, and just ask, what is your provocation for the Firestarters audience, please?
So my provocation is it getting harder to design good services?
Fantastic. Okay, so we'll come to that, because I think one of the things you say in the blurb, actually, on the back of your book, is about most services that we use every day aren't designed to meet our needs. And in fact, actually, you say that most of the services that we use are not designed at all. So I'd kind of like to dive into that as a starting point, really, and then we can get into why perhaps it is harder to or not to design services today. So what do you think are the most common things that go wrong with service design?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question. And I would say the biggest problem with services is that they aren't designed. Like you said, the number one problem with service design is that it doesn't happen. And sadly, most of the services that we use on a day-to-day basis are designed as a sort of accidental byproduct of lots of other decisions that we make in our organizations. So things like moving between different technologies or political trends, personal taste, decisions that happen in meeting rooms that seemingly have nothing to do with the experience that a user will have, but actually have a huge effect on the things that we encounter as users from a service. And that, unfortunately, is the norm for most services. They're designed by accident, between lots of other decisions that we make. And the reason for that is that services by their nature are kind of invisible. A service is basically something that helps someone to achieve an end goal, helps them to do something like buy a car or start a business or open a bank account. But often the individual tasks that someone has to go through in order to achieve that end goal are not only provided by multiple different organizations or multiple different teams, they're often not seen as a total set of activities. So we don't tend to see the connections between those things, which means that we don't design those connections, and our users sort of fall between the cracks. So it's very difficult for organizations to design something that they don't see or don't necessarily acknowledge exists. And I think that's the major challenge for service design, is how do you design something that, to all intents and purposes, for the organization that you work with, doesn't actually exist? It's kind of like a Schrodinger's cat, but for design. How do you design something that doesn't really exist? Well, you can't. So the first task for service design is to help people to see and understand services as real things, help our organization to see services from the same perspective that our users do, and then to talk about how do we actually think consciously about designing those things. So first services and then service design.
Right. I mean, it's so interesting what you're saying there about how services are not seen as a kind of total set of activities. And in your book, by the way, you have 15 excellent principles for designing good services. And I think their simplicity kind of belies their brilliance, actually, because they really do kind of capture what a good service should be all about. But one of them, I think, speaks to that, which is about being agnostic of organizational structures. And one of the things I'd like to ask you about is, Conways law, as it's often called. So organizations design systems that mirror their own communication structures. So do you think that is something which is hugely prevalent in services and outside of services as well? Other innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say Conway's law is probably one of the biggest driving forces behind service design, or the sort of accidental design of services. You know, if you think about the fact that we're not necessarily consciously in control of our services because we're not really thinking about their design most of the time, we're leaving them up to the kind of whims of other things that happen in our organization. And the major influence on our services is how we ourselves are structured. So from everything, you know, to do with the fact that if you have, say, for example, 10 separate teams, you're much more likely to produce 10 separate services. It also comes down to not just structures, but also ways of working and cultural aspects of your organization. So if you have an organization that is quite mistrustful of users, then you will often have services that require lots of evidence and require lots of kind of burdens of proof on your users, lots of checkpoints. So you'll start to see that. If you have an organization that is pretty disorganized, it doesn't have clear understanding of what it does itself, that will come out in the services, and your users won't be clear about what the service is for, and they'll find it quite disorientating. So, you know, and what I find surprising is that we find that surprising, you know, that we find it surprising that our own ways of working show to our users. And of course they do, you know, we're just not necessarily aware of those things, I think, most of the time.
And we have a lot of marketers listening and watching Firestarters, and one of the quotes that you have in the book from Russell Davis, actually one of our other Firestarters speakers, is the product is the service is the marketing. And that sort of fusion really between product and service and marketing. Can you tell me a bit more about your view on that and what that means?
Yeah, I think it's a great quote from Russell that's, as soon as he said it, sort of, it's one of those things that just sticks in your head and it kind of resonates. But for me, I think what that means is basically you cannot market something that doesn't work. You know, gone are the days where you can create a brilliant campaign for something that is absolutely awful, because essentially, you know, our products and our services are responsible for selling themselves now. You know, yes, we put money into making sure that we're, you know, targeting the right audiences and the right influencers in the right places, but really we're relying on people to, you know, kind of share that thing themselves. And products don't really exist outside of the context of services either. You know, if you have, you know, something that is say, for example, a you know, kind of classic product, like a clothing brand, for example, right? People are having to buy clothes. The product itself, you know, can be brilliant. But if someone buys something and they receive the wrong thing, or they buy something and it's the wrong size and they can't send it back, or they get a snotty email from someone saying, you know, well, you shouldn't have bought that, or it's over the 14 days that you're allowed to return that thing, then you're not going to have a good experience of that brand. And you can do all the marketing you like, but you're still not going to buy those clothes again. So I think that's really what this comes down to, is that the increasing importance of not just products working, but services working around those products, and that those things now are taking the weight of the majority of the marketing that we now do.
And do you think it's fair to say that there was a famous article, Mark Andreessen, I think, wrote it back in 2011, so over a decade ago, but software is eating the world, and he was really talking about how software is kind of taking over everything. And so the idea of products becoming services, you know, an increasing number of products becoming services, because even sort of physical things through subscription models perhaps, or they're developing an app or a direct to consumer proposition, you know, they're effectively becoming services in their own right. So do you think the lessons of good service design are needed more than ever? Do you think that's still the case, that more products are becoming services?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's really interesting actually is if you look back at the history of service design, is that it came from basically a time when lots of previously public organizations, things like, you know, insurance, telecommunications, healthcare, things that are kind of existed on the borders of kind of public-private kind of, support for our lives, basically increasingly had to start competing with one another. So some of the kind of earliest clients for service design were big telcos, who were just having to kind of move from the world of being public services here in the UK. And I think what's really interesting about that is that you started to see this increasing awareness of the importance of competing on service rather than competing on the product. Because with telecommunications and with data, essentially you're selling something that's so intangible that it may as well not be a product at all. And actually the entire thing that you're providing is, yes, it is broadband speeds, and yes, it is, number of text messages, but it's also about the service that you're getting around the outside of it. And I think that's what we saw actually as the kind of the legacy of service design comes from that world. But what's interesting actually about this kind of increasing sort of servicization that drove that industry is that I think it's often been done without necessarily thinking about the impact of that service. So we all had this amazing, kind of a utopian vision of getting rid of cars so that we can all have rideshare, kind of interactions instead, or that we could somehow rent out our spare room, on Airbnb, and that just kind of hasn't happened, right? Ride hailing apps haven't gotten rid of cars, they've increased the number of cars. Various different services that help us to access accommodation more easily haven't improved our access to housing, they've actually made it worse. And so I think what we've seen is that kind of proliferation of kind of services without necessarily thinking about the impact of them. Because the thing about services is that they scale far faster than a product could ever even imagine. And it means that their impact is greater, and it means that the negative impacts are also greater as well. And I think that's something that we have not thought about early enough and deep enough really in service design, is the kind of the network effect of what that scale looks like on the world.
Yeah, so interesting. And I guess that leads me to think about how organizations can really approach service design in a way that actually enables them to perhaps not be subject to some of those challenges, but also to do it in a way which is more joined up. I mean, to our earlier conversation about Conway's law. So how can you work as an organization to create services which are aware of the impact that they have, but also are more joined up and seen as that total set of activities that you talked about before?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to what you define as a good service, right? So we're used to, in our organizations, thinking about good services entirely from the perspective of an individual user. So, we put all of our effort into highly optimizing the user experience. And, if the experience works for that individual user, then fantastic, we've done a really good job, and hopefully we'll make some money out of it. And I think that is a particularly kind of myopic way of looking at services. And I would challenge people to kind of broaden their horizons about what we mean by good. So when I'm thinking about services, I always like to think about it as both good for an individual user, in that it gets them what they need and what they're trying to get to. And hopefully, if it's a commercial service, that means that they ascribe some value to that we can then also have as well as a company. That service also needs to be good for our organization as well, and not just good in terms of financially sustainable, but it also means that it needs to be something that we can provide easily, and that we can do so in a way that it works for our staff as well. They're not doing something that is going to burn out those staff really quickly. So it's good for our organization. The next thing we need to think about is it actually good for the planet? Is it good for the world? Is it good for society? Is it good for that wider context? Because all too often what we do is we encourage behaviors in individual users that actually, if we were to zoom out and look at the overall network effect, like I said, and think about that, we would start to realize that didn't work. And so I think it's really about sort of consequence scanning of the things that we do, and understanding what is the, if we were to kind of play this forwards and think about what the effect of this would be, what would happen. And it doesn't mean that we have to catastrophize the impact of every single thing that we do, because not every service falls into that category, right? But I think it pays to help us to think about those things, because not only is that important to think about how financially sustainable our services are, but how sustainable they are in the world, because increasingly we're starting to see a link between that. It is not possible for us to run financially sustainable organizations if they are not environmentally sustainable, if they're not sustainable to communities as well, because we will eventually run out of resources. And I think we're increasingly seeing that link. So it's not just, it's not about being kind of doom and gloom about this, but it's about really thinking about good from the perspective of individual users, our organization, and society and the planet more widely, because they are far more connected than I think we've really thought about before.
Yeah, and I'd love to ask as well about user or customer centricity, because so many of you, the things that you talk about, the principles you talk about in your book, are just so logical, and yet somehow don't happen. And many companies talk about being very customer focused and very customer first and so on, and yet somehow things get in the way of that approach. So what do you think are the techniques or things that organizations and teams can really do to genuinely think about user needs and to genuinely design things around user needs?
Yeah, I think it's a really good observation. And actually, this is the reason why I ended up writing the book Good Services in the first place, because I did think long and hard about it. Looking at those principles, I thought to myself, do people really need to be told that they need to set the expectations of their users, or to make it accessible, or to help people to find it? I mean, for goodness sakes, if we can't make people find our services, then we're really in trouble, right? But in reality, those are the things that we find the hardest, because they are the most difficult things to do. To make your service findable, you have to understand what someone wants, what they're looking for, what they're searching for, the words that they're going to use to search for that thing, the people that they're going to ask about that thing. And you have to look at your service from that perspective. You have to understand those different words and those different perspectives. And that is something that we do not often do. We speak a totally different language in our organization. We use acronyms and backronyms and numbers and letters and things that just our users don't recognize. And so that's very difficult to do, is to see our services from those perspectives. So the reason why those 15 principles are the principles of good service design and not great service design is because they are the absolute bare minimum that anyone needs to do in order to make sure that service is usable. And I talked about the history of service design a little bit earlier on. That was my history as well. In joining the service design industry, my first jobs were working on gas and electric bills. I've designed many utility bills. And I can tell you, the amount of conversations that I've had with people where they get so excited about providing some kind of brilliant, wonderful, light bulb experience for users, and yet the bills are miscalculated, and we can't tell people how much energy they've used, which we still can't, by the way. Those things are the real fundamental problems of services, and those are the things that provide just the level of life admin that we all have to deal with. Refunds that don't get processed, and emails that don't get replied to, and bills that are miscalculated. And this is really the hard work of service design, is just making things work. And that is, that's where we need to focus our effort. A little bit less on the making things shiny, a little bit more on calculating bills. It's not as fun, and I get why people don't want to do it, and it is harder, and it's often to do with technology, infrastructure, ways of working. But we used to have a saying at Government Digital Service, and apologies if I have misquoted anyone who came up with this, because I can't, it's one of those things we used to say, and I don't remember who came up with it. But it basically said, do the hard work to make things simple. And that is really the job of service design. It's often doing really, really hard work for essentially the end outcome to be something that is so simple that people don't even notice that you've done all that work. So yeah.
So I'd love to ask then about some of the shiny technology, which is obviously getting a lot of focus at the moment. So artificial intelligence and so on. So what are the ways do you think that organizations and teams can really, how can they build that new technology and new potential into services in ways that are user-centric and really align with the kind of principles that you've talked about?
I think first of all is understanding how people are going to use it, right? So I think we all, as strategists and designers, technologists, people who are involved in understanding those technologies have this, again, sort of sunny utopic vision of how those things are going to be potentially used, or we have nightmarish visions of how they could also potentially be used. The reality will probably be much more mundane, and in fact, actually, I was talking to a banking organization in South America, and they were talking about the fact that they had massively been adopting AI, and particularly ChatGPT, and their way of using it was basically to automate sending emails to each other, which I loved. So they're basically just automating communicating with each other, so that they didn't have to be involved in the nonsense of constant emails. And I particularly love the idea of these emails just getting increasingly nonsensical as they're basically getting more and more generic, replying to each other. Dear John, thank you so much for your strategic input to my strategic input. Thank you, regards, that kind of thing. But it really brought home to me that actually, the entire definition of these technologies will be in the way that people use them. I have particularly, kind of some thoughts about the way in which they'll change probably how people find services. So, at the moment, Google or your equivalent search engine, it is the homepage to your service, right? No one goes to a website to look for a service. They will go to a search and then they will look for that thing. And if they can't find it, they'll go elsewhere. That potentially is not how people will find services in the future. And it potentially is not how they'll interact with them. And this blurred line between, where you find something and where that thing exists and where it starts and where it ends, what is human, what is not human, who is an authoritative voice and what is not authoritative. We've seen that line blurring for the last 15 years, and it's going to continue to blur. And I think it will require increasing levels of technology and media literacy on people to use those things. And so finding ways that we can kind of ethically signpost the authorship, the origin, those sorts of things of our services may become particularly important, particularly from a security point of view. So there's no way I can summarize how new technology will affect services, but I think the main thing is for those of us who are working in spaces where user behavior will be impacted by those different technologies is to really spend time looking at different groups of people using those technologies and understand the ways in which they will genuinely change their behavior, and focus a little bit more on that and a little bit less on the technology itself, because technology can do anything. We not literally anything, but there are so many infinite possibilities, and it's really about how we use it. I think that's most important.
And I guess that leads me to ask about inclusion, actually, because one of the principles is about being usable by everyone equally. And I think in the book you say about inclusion is more than just accessibility. So talk to me a bit more about what you mean by inclusion.
Yeah. So I think inclusion is often, particularly in a digital product and service space, reduced down to accessibility, and particularly just around digital accessibility. So we tend to think about where if this thing passes this particular accessibility test, then that thing will work. So, does it work for someone who's using a screen reader, for example? Does the color contrast work? We spend a lot of time thinking about that. We spend less time thinking about whether or not our service is going to misgender someone, or if someone is going to have to get somewhere physically to use it, or if we're requiring someone to enter in a phone number or a credit card that they may or may not have access to because their phone might be compromised because of an abusive relationship, or they don't have a bank account because they don't have a permanent address. So I think what I mean by that is really that when we're thinking about including people who have otherwise been excluded from our service previously is that we need to really broaden our definition of what we mean by inclusion and therefore what we mean by exclusion. So we're thinking about the things that people can and can't do. So things like read, remember things, get somewhere physically, the actual things that someone can or cannot do. We're also thinking about the things that are to do with that person's identity, their gender, their sexual orientation, their race, their, wherever they're from, that person's identity, their religion, for example. All of those things might have an effect on the way they use that service as well. So if you don't allow someone to change their gender, if you only allow someone to speak to you on a weekend, all of these things will affect who can use the service. But then there's also stuff to do with what that person has or doesn't have as well. So the things that they have access to in their lives. Do they have a car? Do they have a stable internet connection? Do they have a printer? So many services still assume that everyone has a printer. And of course, most people do not have one. And these things are really important as well. So I always like to think about it from those three perspectives: the things that someone can or can't do, the things to do with that person's identity, and then the things that that person has or does not have access to. And then once we start broadening it out into those three different categories, we start to see that this is more than just that first category of kind of accessibility and just in the digital space. We're thinking about a much, much wider set of things that can keep someone out of our service.
And I think there was one phrase actually which I really liked in the book, which is good services are verbs and bad services are nouns. And so can you tell me a bit more about what you mean by that? What does that mean?
Yeah, so good services are verbs, bad services are nouns, was something that basically I ended up kind of repeating. It's almost like a sort of odd mantra when I was working in government, because one of the biggest problems that most services have is that we use language internally that our users don't use and don't recognize to talk about the thing they're trying to do. So if you think about the fact that a service is something that helps someone to do something, that thing is often basically a verb. It's a verb-based activity, like learn to drive or buy a car or renew my contract, whatever that thing is. Those words, those verbs are really different to the names that we use to refer to our services. So things like statutory off-road vehicle notification or charity letter forwarding service. I can name some of my, actually, one of my favorite noun-based service is called ARAMS, which is the Sheep and Cattle Tracing Service from the UK government. And I don't mean to pick on that one particularly, but the acronym is just absolutely priceless. So what we tend to do is that we name our services basically by names that we can use to refer back to them, because nouns are easier for us to use to shorten. But that means that basically that language that we use completely diverges from the language that our users use. And so, of course, those services end up being completely unfindable because no one knows that the ARAMS or the SORN service exists. So how do you find something when you don't know that that thing exists? Well, you can't. So that's really why it's so important for us to think about services as verbs, because really what we need to be talking about is the thing that our user is actually trying to get done, the thing that they are going to be searching for, the thing that they're going to be looking to get done. And when we think about services in that way, they get a lot bigger, right? So, rather than just thinking about, kind of the wildlife mitigation license, if you want to move bats, we're not just talking about that one license. We're talking about finding a registered ecologist. We're talking about relocating those bats. We're talking about, kind of doing a survey on your property. It's much, much bigger. So thinking about verbs helps us to basically make our services more findable, but it also helps us to redefine the scope of those services so they better reflect the totality of what someone is actually trying to get done, which is often quite different to what we think they're trying to get done.
Brilliant. That's so useful. Thank you, Lou. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I've just got one final question, which is it strikes me there's just so many parallels here with the approach that you're championing towards good services, and marketing, and if you're a strategist looking to design solutions for customers or communications that resonate and so on. So any final thoughts for strategists or marketers looking to kind of design their campaigns, their communications, the things that they're doing, that actually they can use some of the learning perhaps from a good service design?
Yeah, I would say my kind of one message to that kind of space. No, let me rephrase that. I think the one thing that is helpful to bear in mind when you're doing that type of work is that the details are really important. All too often, I think the response that people have to service design is that, well, that's too detailed, right? That's I'm doing the strategy, I'm doing the overall campaign for this. I don't need to worry about how people find my thing, or what the email is like, or whether or not this particular part is inclusive to this particular audience. And you absolutely do. The kind of the success or failure of the thing that you're doing, no matter how big or how strategic, will succeed or fail by whether or not someone gets an email, or by whether or not someone could find your service. These things are really important. So I would say is just take a little look at that list of 15 principles. They're free. You can find them on good.services. You, of course, can read the book if you get interested in them, but really look at your service, have a look around, really go through the process that your user has to go through. And if you can say that your service is actually achieving all of those things, and that you're helping people to find it, and it's accessible, and it's inclusive, and it sets people's expectations, then fantastic. You can get on with your strategic job. But if you find there are some problems there, then that is the time to start focusing on those details. And, I teach everyone in all sorts of different organizations, public service, private sector, big corporate, small startups, CEOs, down to people who are, working in call centers on services. And everyone needs to be involved in the design of services. There is not one single decision that we make in our organization that doesn't affect the experience that someone will have of it. And so every decision you make needs to bear in mind the effect that it will have on your end user. And so if you just have those principles in the back of your mind when you're making those decisions, that's better than nothing. So yeah, I would encourage everyone to just really spend a little bit of time looking at the detail of their service and thinking about it from that perspective.
Thank you, Lou. That's been so insightful and really excellent. So please do check out Lou's book, which is, of course, Good Services. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and also to share the episode. But my thanks again to Lou. Thank you very much for being a part of Firestarters. Thank you.
Thank you.